So again, welcome again for the last session of the day, Global Azure Bootcamp. We have been doing this event for many years now, and it's a wonderful place to come and learn Azure and Microsoft technologies in general. So I've been speaking at the Azure Bootcamp, Global Azure Bootcamp for last 5 years now. And every single time it had been a wonderful journey, except obviously that this time we are doing it virtually. Previously we always had like face-to-face interaction, and that was definitely a great way to do these sessions. But nevertheless, this is what it is. So I hope everyone is keeping well in these times. And I'm pretty sure that if you are here attending this session virtually, that tells that how excited you are to learn about Azure technologies and how interested you are in Microsoft Cloud, and that will definitely take you a long way. So with that, let's just get started. So what exactly is Azure Arc? So I'm going to be talking about pretty much like all about Azure Arc with respect to what does it do, what it doesn't do, because that's more important. That it can enable hybrid cloud, but what are the limitations? What are the things that it cannot do? Those will be some areas that I'll be going in deep. So quick intro about me. I currently work at Spectra Systems. I'm the director of technology over there. Prior to Spectra Systems, I spent time at Microsoft, where I was an Azure consultant. So I typically work on all cloud platforms, but Microsoft Azure is basically the go-to cloud platform for me. Written a couple of books. I'm an MCT and a bunch of Azure subscription certifications as well. So quite some experience with Azure. With that, let's see what we have today. So cloud is no longer a future; it's a reality now. So like startups, mid-sized companies, large enterprise, everyone is looking at leveraging cloud's computing power and the innovation to kind of drive their business in agile fashion. So with that, today we are in a scenario where all the large organizations, even smaller organizations, have tons of types of infrastructure, tons of types of applications, hundreds to thousands of applications built on different frameworks, running on different operating systems, starting from Windows to Linux and so on. Companies are having their own data centers, multiple data centers in different branch offices and so on. uh, Leveraging different sort of hardware, leveraging different sort of virtualization technologies, including VMware, Hyper-V, or even some of the open source technologies such as KVM and stuff. And then cloud, like multi-cloud is basically the way to go. Companies are having multi-cloud solutions where they are running on Azure, AWS, GCP, and even other cloud platforms, typically to make sure that even if a cloud platform has issues, their application can still continue to run. So at this time, we are in a scenario where an organization may have various environments which have to be managed completely separately, using different set of tools, using different set of process and policies. For example, if you have a data center built on Hyper-V, you probably will have System Center tools to manage your Hyper-V infrastructure, including System Center Virtual Machine Manager for your virtualization management, including your, for example, if you have a System Center Operation Manager for your monitoring and stuff. That those sort of tools and technologies will be managing your on-prem data centers. Then if at the same time, if you also have an Azure infrastructure, you will be using Azure tools to manage that. You'll be using Azure Resource Manager, you'll be using Portal, CLI, APIs, whatever is that you like to manage Azure with. If you are again having AWS as well in your overall infrastructure, the AWS environment will have its own management tools, own management technologies, and because there are so many of these environments, and each environment have its own management sort of landscape, you will end up having sort of different policies and process. If not too much different, at least little bit of variant of your policies and processes will be different in each environment. And that brings a very challenging situation where how do you make sure that no matter where your Linux VMs are running or Windows VMs are running, no matter where your database is running, you want to make sure that your database and applications and servers are protected and governed exact same way. If you don't want allowing, for example, a specific firewall port, You don't want that to be allowed across any of the environment to make sure there's a consistency. So because of these many different tools for different environments, that making sure everything is exact and everything is consistent is becoming a challenge. How do you make sure that your security capabilities are consistent across the environment? You go and apply policies to protect, for example, antivirus policies, or it could be Windows updates policies, or it could be Linux SSH policies. So all those configuration items, you go and apply them in different environments. Then you have to go inside each environment and make sure it is working right. There is no configuration drift happening. And with those things, every time if your leadership, if your technology leadership comes and asks you, can you make sure that our SSH is disabled, or SSH is not running on 22 port across all the environments, you have to go and check 5 different places. So again, overhead management, overhead it brings to you. Then every now and then you will have requirements from development teams, you will have requirements from applications team that, hey, they want to run their applications and databases. And depending on where you plan to host it, Azure, AWS, your on-prem, edge locations, depending on the hosting target, you will have another set of challenges with respect to what sort of specifications you can put there, what sort of configurations and performance metrics you need. So pretty much you are managing different environments separately. And that's where Azure Arc comes into picture, and they say, hey, we understand that you have got so many environments. We understand that it's very challenging to manage those so many environments, and we have got something here for you. So that's where the hybrid strategy from Microsoft, where you manage your hybrid cloud in a consistent way. So no matter if your infrastructure, if you're running your servers and if you're running your VMs in AWS or in Azure or in your VMware environments or in your Hyper-V environments, you can manage them the exact same way. That's what Azure Arc provides you. Similarly, if you have got, if you want to run data services, databases, and things like that, you will have the opportunity to manage them the exact same way and have the exact same consistent experience, management experience, developer experience across the environments. That's what Azure Arc does. Microsoft has got like other hybrid cloud solutions as well, like Azure Stack is there, Azure Stack HCI is there, and with Azure IoT, you can even host, the services like cognitive services and so on the edge devices. So tons of hybrid cloud strategy. However, we are going to focus truly on Azure Arc today. So Azure Arc does nothing but brings the Azure's control plane, that is the ability to manage your infrastructure using Azure Portal or Azure CLI or Azure REST API, PowerShell, or any other Azure tool that you use. Use the exact same set of tools to manage your infrastructure in any environment. That's what Azure Arc does. And how does it do it? We'll learn about that. So essentially, you have your own infrastructure or you're using a different cloud platform. You will deploy your servers the exact same way you are deploying as of today. You will deploy your Kubernetes clusters, but you will use the Azure's tool to manage it. And Arc is the intermediary service between that. So essentially, when you manage your on-prem servers using Azure Portal, the Azure Arc services are coming into picture. And it's not just about management. Management is the one portion of it. Arc also enables you to run some of the Azure services in your data center. So for example, you must have used Azure SQL databases. It's a very simple service and very powerful to run SQL databases in Azure. It's basically go-to database service if you need a relational database in Azure. Then SQL Managed Instance, which came out as a really powerful SQL cloud managed database where you are not really losing any of the server level administration stuff. So that's basically essentially SQL management is doing. With Arc, you can run those SQL managed instances on your own hardware in your own data centers. You get the exact same experience, and you get many of the capabilities as well from Azure. So if you're running a SQL managed instance in Azure and in your on-prem, you're developers, your applications team will have the consistent experience, and they will not have to worry about, okay, they have to, customize something or request something specific in order to get a database service from on-prem. So more management and Azure services on-prem, that's the combination of that brings you Azure Arc, where one portion allows you to manage your infrastructure the exact same way you manage your Azure infrastructure, and the other portion of Azure Arc allows you to deploy some of the Azure services on premises. Please note, it's some of the Azure services. That doesn't mean Arc doesn't mean that you can go and deploy, Azure VM on premises. That's not really an option. Or you can deploy any of it doesn't include all the services. At this time, it only includes two services, which is Azure SQL Managed Instance and Azure PostgreSQL Hyperscale Database Service. Those are the two database services that are available under Azure Arc enabled services as of today. But as the product evolves, as the service evolves, you can expect to see many other services coming into this umbrella where you are able to run your Azure services outside Azure as well. So use cases, essentially three use cases are there for Azure Arc at this moment. That is organize and govern across environments. So essentially manage your servers, governance, security posture, monitoring across environments, that is Azure, any other cloud platform, on-prem or elsewhere, exact same way. Second is at scale Kubernetes app management. So if you're running Kubernetes clusters and if you have container-based workload running on them, you can use Azure Arc to manage the application deployment on your Kubernetes cluster consistently. So Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes brings GitOps, where you can have your all applications configurations and everything managed in GitOps, in GitHub or any other Git repository. And with GitOps, you kind of make your infrastructure as a code for Kubernetes and keep that in Git, and everything else is kind of does happens automatically. So very powerful yet simple CI/CD with GitOps you can get with at scale Kubernetes app management. And along with app management, the Azure Arc Kubernetes services can also allow you to run some of the policies, like use Azure policies or use Microsoft Azure Monitor for containers to do the full monitoring and governance aspects of a Kubernetes cluster. And the last use case, that is run data services anywhere. So this allows you to run Azure's data services, including Managed Instance and SQL Managed Instance and PostgreSQL Hyperscale Database Service. You can run both of them outside Azure as well. So essentially three things it does at the moment. So at this time, I'll take a quick pause. If there are any questions, if there is anything, please feel free to comment and I will address that. I do not see any questions at this moment. So we will now continue for the next session. Next portion of the session. So far, we kind of touched base that Arc allows you to bring the Azure's capabilities outside Azure. So talking about the infrastructure, what does it give? So it gives you visibility. So essentially, you manage all your servers in a single pane of glass. So you go to Azure portal. Inside the Azure portal, you will find your Hyper-V VMs, VMware VMs, AWS instances, even any other cloud instances. You see all of them in one place, which gives you ability to kind of monitor them and make sure you are under compliance and make sure that you have a consistency in terms of configuration, that your configuration is very consistent across the environments. So that way you are covered when we talk about any of the regulatory requirements, because you are maintaining and managing your infrastructure resources the exact same way, irrespective of the environment. The Arc-enabled services allows you to run the Azure's powerful cloud services in on-prem, which basically means that if your development teams are using managed instance for a long time, and you have a hardware to leverage, basically you have your own hardware available and you want to use that without really impacting the experience for your development teams, you can deploy that managed instance on-prem, and they can continue using the exact same processes and tools to connect to their SQL databases running in managed instance, irrespective of whether it is running in Azure or it is running in on-prem. Now, because you can run these data services anywhere you want, you can actually put them closer to your workloads, closer to your applications. So that means if you have a very latency sensitive workload running in edge location in some remote location, maybe somewhere in the middle of sea or somewhere in the mountains, you can run the Azure's data services right then and there in the sea or in the mountain, and make sure that your application never really have to worry about getting the data access at the performance it needs. It keeps on getting updated all the time. So as soon as Microsoft releases a new feature, they also bring it to Arc as well, depending on the possibility and feasibility. So, but continuously, you will continue to receive the features from cloud as well. So this particular screen that you see, it basically talks about Azure control plane, the Azure's management scenario. So Azure has got Azure regions, which are nothing but data centers across the globe, where they are running resources through a resource providers like servers, Kubernetes, databases, and so on. Then they have control plane, which is basically the Azure Resource Manager through which you manage everything. And then you have various tools, technologies to kind of manage it, such as Azure Monitor, Security Center, automation. That's how you manage this is basically the architecture of an Azure management and governance. When we talk about Arc, the facilities, you bring the facilities, multi-cloud data center or edge, and you run Azure Arc as a service. And in the end, at the top level, your tools and control plane remains same. So essentially, infrastructure is still yours. It's just that you're going to now use Azure tools to manage that. So I see that what is Azure Arc enabled configuration management and which Kubernetes distribution are supported by Azure Arc. So I'm going to be talking about both of them in detail in a while. So I have dedicated a couple of slides for Kubernetes. So I would say like hang on for a couple of minutes and I will be addressing those questions. So coming back to the Azure Arc enabled infrastructure. So servers, it supports Windows servers and Linux servers supported pretty much running anywhere. It also supports AWS Linux as well, various Linux flavors, as you can see, Ubuntu, SUSE, Red Hat, and many others as well. So no matter where you are running these Windows and Linux machines, you can govern them through Azure Arc. Then Azure Arc enabled SQL Server supports SQL Server machines that you're running anywhere. So it could be a SQL Server on Windows or Linux running in your data center. And the third is Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes. So the Kubernetes, it supports obviously Azure's own Kubernetes service, which is running on Azure Stack HCI or Rancher or a Ubuntu based or GKE or OpenShift. I'm not sure if it supports. I'm not sure if it supports the AWS EKS, Elastic Kubernetes Service. I guess that's what they call it. I'm not sure if that is supported yet or not, but many of the Kubernetes flavors are supported. And when I'm talking about supported Kubernetes flavor, these are the ones which are validated by Microsoft for performance and compatibility purpose. It does not mean that if a Kubernetes version which is not listed in supported list will not work. It may work because Azure Arc is doing nothing but deploying some of the containers on and pods and some of the configurations in your Kubernetes clusters to provide that whole data services and management experience. So even if it is not supported, it may work. It's just that supported means it is validated by Microsoft for performance and compatibility purpose. So it will work best, and Microsoft will support it if there is some issue. Then we talked about Azure Arc enabled servers. To go in detail, you can kind of track and monitor them at the one place. Over here, essentially, you will use few tools. So you will use Azure RBAC, Azure Roles. So you can give like reader, contributor, and any other Azure roles that you have available in portal to your infrastructure resources as well. You can use Azure Security Center to protect these servers from from security threats, run vulnerability assessments, and so on. And use Microsoft Defender antivirus for live protection. You can use Azure Sentinel for the SIEM and logging purpose. So all those tools are available when you use Azure Arc enabled servers. Then you can obviously organize an inventory. You get all your servers in one place, irrespective of the environment, and you can use Azure Monitor to monitor them as well continuously. So we talked about some of these tools already. A couple of tools that I missed to talk in previous slide is update management and change and inventory tracking. So you can use Azure Automation's update management solution to make sure your Windows and Linux machines are up to date all the time. And you can use the inventory tracking and change management to kind of track the configuration drifts and such on your known Azure machines. So the same things that you can do on your Azure machines, now you can do those things on your Azure non-Azure machines as well. Here's an example where you have a server. If you can see on the top, it says server-Azure Arc. So it's not an Azure VM, it's an Azure Arc server. And over here, you can kind of, you can see that we have applied policies, which is telling us that this VM is with an insecure password, and we can see it's non-compliant. So many of those things are available here using Azure policy that you can use and track them in the exact same way. Here we are using the Azure Monitor Insights. So here I can see from an on-prem server that which all ports are being used by which all services, what's the version. So I can do that whole mapping and performance thing right here. Talking about Arc-enabled SQL servers. So this is your SQL virtual machines or SQL physical servers running on Linux or Windows outside Azure. So essentially, at this time, Azure Arc-enabled SQL Server only includes some of the security benefits. So you can run Azure's SQL security assessment on your on-prem server, which kind of gives you an idea of what are the vulnerabilities in your SQL databases, what are the best practices not being followed, and you can act on them. So over here, for example, you can see that I'm in SQL Servers Azure Arc, and these are all the machines which are running outside my Azure regions, and I can manage them from a SQL. Like this is basically what I can do with SQL Server through Azure Arc. I can assess them from a security and compliance perspective. I can assess from availability and business continuity, performance, update management, and there are a few more categories that I can use. So now I have visibility into my databases hosted outside Azure, and I can tune them in to make sure I have the consistent configurations and send it back to best practices across the environments. Talking about Kubernetes, so we talked about at high level that how you can run, how you can use Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes to build your GitOps practices across the Kubernetes environment running anywhere. So deploy your Kubernetes applications through Azure Portal and GitOps capabilities, and manage your Kubernetes cluster using Azure Policies, Azure Monitor, Security Center, Sentinel. So all those capabilities you get with Kubernetes as well. So servers, it was only management governance. You cannot deploy servers through Azure Arc. Kubernetes, you can deploy applications on Kubernetes cluster through Azure Arc. You can obviously manage and govern them, but again, you cannot deploy Kubernetes clusters itself using Azure Arc. You have to have clusters ready in advance. You have to have servers ready in advance. So that's essentially the differences. So over here, I can see that I'm in a Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes workspace in the screenshot. So here I can add a configuration which is coming from a GitHub repository in this example. And the GitHub repository can include the artifacts, all the manifest, all your YAML files, and any other resources that you need. It can support Helm as well. So you can have your Helm charts in GitHub repository. And all you need to do is just add this configuration, and Azure Arc will make sure that all those applications defined in your GitHub repository are deployed to your Kubernetes clusters across everywhere. So essentially, if you have an application which you need to run in multiple places, you can have one source code of your application, you can have one configuration code of your application. So essentially, use your use the exact same YAML files and manifest to deploy your application in Azure, outside Azure, your Azure locations. So just one source of deployment. So no matter where, your application will be consistent. You will have the exact same version, exact same configurations across the places. And obviously, if you want to have different versions, you can have that too. But this basically ensures that your environment is your application's deployment is consistent across Azure and outside. So that was Kubernetes configurations. Next is Kubernetes policies. So similar to the way we are having servers management and governance through Azure policies. Similarly, you can govern your Kubernetes cluster as well. So, for example, you can have a policy that each Kubernetes cluster must have these logging, a logging application deployed across anywhere. So, whenever you add a new cluster in future, all you need to do is just onboard that to Arc, and Arc will make sure that your every Kubernetes cluster have the same logging mechanism deployed everywhere. So insights. So this is again powered by Azure Monitor. So here you can monitor your on-prem Kubernetes cluster the way you monitor your Azure Kubernetes cluster with respect to cluster performance, data controllers, containers, like all of that. So I'll take a pause here before moving into Azure Arc-enabled services. So far we talked about servers and Kubernetes, and now let's see if there are any questions. So I hope the Kubernetes questions are answered with this. If not, please ask that again. There's a nice question: how Azure Arc is different from Azure Stack? So for that, I'll take a step back. Okay, so when we talk about Microsoft's hybrid cloud story, we talked about a couple of options. Azure Arc is one, Azure Stack is one, and then Azure IoT Edge services are another option. So three different scenarios. Arc we just discussed. Now let's talk about Azure Stack so that we are kind of clear with respect to what's the difference between Stack and Arc, and what do we get, what we don't get. So Azure Stack also has two different variations. Earlier it was just Azure Stack. Now there is Azure Stack Hub and there is Azure Stack HCI. So I'll talk about the Azure Stack Hub first. So this is the first hybrid cloud service, like a first Azure Stack-based service, Azure Resource Manager-based service, which was available in hybrid. It was launched a few years back. So Azure Stacks is a specialized private cloud service which comes with specialized hardware. So if you want Azure Stack, you have to buy a specialized hardware from some of the vendors, like HP is one, Lenovo is one. So there are few hardware vendors who provides Azure Stack specialized hardware. So when you go and want to deploy Azure Stack, you have to buy that whole hardware piece from the hardware vendor, and you will have to obviously buy the Azure Stack services from Microsoft. And when it gets delivered to you, it's a pre-configured Azure cloud running in your own data center. You don't have to connect this to Azure. It can continue to remain completely independent. You can connect this to Azure and have a hybrid cloud story as well. So this is specialized hardware, which includes specialized servers, and it includes specialized networking components, specialized servers component, and like it kind of comes as a suite. And you cannot just go and run Azure Stack on a hardware of your choice in production. You can do like trial. There's a trial mode available that you can run on a one server, but that's not really for production. But in order to deploy Azure Stack in production, you must buy that specialized hardware, and you get a kind of a private Azure cloud in your own data center. Azure Stack HCI is a very recent product from Microsoft when we talk about hybrid cloud. This brings like Azure's some of Azure services and management capabilities to any commodity hardware. So no matter what hardware you have, you can deploy Azure Stack HCI over there as long as it supports standard virtualization stuff. So that is Azure Stack. Azure Arc, you already have your servers, you already have your infrastructure. You are using Azure Arc to manage and govern it. So that's basically the difference between Stack and Arc. Arc, it's your own infrastructure, own hardware, on VMs and everything pre-deployed and running. Azure Stack, you have to buy that specialized hardware to run that service. So yeah, I hope that answers that question. So moving forward with Azure Arc enabled services. So this is where we are bringing Azure Arc enabled SQL managed instance and Azure Arc enabled PostgreSQL instance. So you can have these two services where you can run these cloud services in your own data center. So this is not limited to governance and the whole organization aspect of it. This is more than that. You are actually bringing Azure's services in your own data center. In the previous one, you are using Azure's services to manage your data centers, but here you are bringing those services in your data center. So that's quite a difference when we talk about Azure Arc enabled infrastructure and services. It can be in a connected or disconnected mode. All it needs is Kubernetes. So you can deploy SQL managed instance and PostgreSQL Hyperscale anywhere in the world as long as it has a Kubernetes cluster. So the mandatory requirement for Azure Arc enabled services at this moment is Kubernetes. So all you need to do is have a Kubernetes ready and you can deploy SQL or PostgreSQL service from Microsoft over there on any hardware. And it can be in a connected or disconnected mode. That means that you don't have to necessarily keep your data services connected to Azure all the time. It can be disconnected, and every once in a while you can connect it and get updates or upload your monitoring results and so on. So you can use it for any of the applications or analysis services, and the data services included at this moment is PostgreSQL and SQL managed instance, but in future we may have more data services here, such as Cosmos, for example. I don't know if it can come or not, but just an example. But you may have more database services coming through Azure Arc in future as well. Azure Arc Data Controller is the component which does the magic. So basically, you run this Azure Arc Data Controller, which is nothing but a combination of multiple pods, and like it has its own software that runs in your Kubernetes cluster in form of containers. So this data controller is responsible for provisioning of these data services in your Kubernetes cluster, managing the whole HADR aspects, scaling aspects, backup, updates. So the experience of, like, in order to run a SQL managed instance in on-prem, you don't have to worry about underlying things. The data controller is going to be doing those configurations for you. So you do not have to be worrying about the whole HADR aspects. As long as you have enough hardware and you've configured it right, you can use Azure Arc Data Controller to do those heavy lifting for you. Then updates, backup, like you can back up your on-prem databases, which is and back them up to cloud. Use Security Center, Monitor, and then all those services in combination to kind of protect your database services and get that whole monitoring aspects of it ready. Run it on any Kubernetes, that is GKE, OpenShift, or any other supported Kubernetes flavor. Any hardware or any cloud platform. You can run it on Azure Stack as well. So over here, if we look at it, the data controller is the core guy which is doing the job, which is responsible for deploying those data services and maintaining them in your Kubernetes cluster. Everything runs as containers. So everything runs as pods. So the PostgreSQL or SQL managed instance that we're talking about, it runs as containers. But you really don't have to worry about it. You will get the same SQL or PostgreSQL experience through Azure Arc. So moving forward, if we go deep into architecture, so Azure Arc talks to the Kubernetes APIs and the data controller. So once the data, it talks to the Kubernetes APIs to deploy the whole data controller aspects of it. And once the data controller is ready, so if we start, like, in order to deploy it, you have to have something called Azure Data Studio, which is a modern data management, management platform similar to SQL Server Managed Studio, but very extensive. So first of all, you need to have Azure Data Studio. You need to install the CLI version of it. You need to install Azure Arc extensions. So once that's basically your management thing for the provisioning. Once that is deployed, you connect your data studio to Kubernetes clusters. any of the supported Kubernetes cluster basically, and I see EKS is as well supported. Once that is done, the Data Studio will help you deploy the data controller. And once the data controller is deployed, then the Data Studio will be talking directly to data controller, and it will be provisioning those services like PostgreSQL or managed instance, any future data services or analytics services that might come. So you will be deploying it using data controller and Azure Data Studio. And once it is deployed, once it is connected, then you will use obviously your Azure tools to manage it end to end. So at high level, this is the architecture of Azure Arc enabled data services. Data controller is the component which is doing the primary work here, and Data Studio and the CLI is essentially the way to interface with Azure Arc enabled data services. So managed instances. So managed instance, basically you can run it in, obviously it is already there in Azure. If you run it in Azure managed by Microsoft, you get full control, more compatibility comparative to a Azure SQL database. You can run like multiple databases, single databases, elastic pools. So there are like various options here when you want to run it in Azure. If you want to run it on-prem, you can deploy the managed instance on any infrastructure. But over here, you will be managing it using the Azure's tools. Similar way, Hyperscale. So PostgreSQL Hyperscale, you can run it in Azure or you can run it in on-prem using the Azure Arc capabilities. So if you look at kind of a difference with respect to capabilities, so the first portion, if you have a SQL server running in your own environment. The second column describes if you have a Azure Arc enabled PostgreSQL or managed instance running in your own environment. And third option is where you have a SQL managed instance running in Azure. So with respect to security features, you get the exact same security features in all three use cases. Elastic capabilities, the SQL server cannot grow on its own. If you need more infrastructure, if you have it Arc enabled, it can grow on its own as long as you have enough hardware. And obviously, if it's in Azure, Microsoft does the job. Similarly, HANDR, same things. In case of a general SQL server, you have to take care of that manually. It doesn't include by default. Whereas Arc enabled, as long as you have the underlying hardware, different sites, everything is available, Arc can manage it for you. You just have to provide the required infrastructure, required hardware. Auto upgrade, patching, backup, restore, monitoring, all these things are consistent when it comes to Arc enabled data services and the data service running in Azure. But obviously, if you have your own unmanaged SQL servers, you have to configure that separately. Compliance. So Azure includes all the compliance certifications from different regulatory authorities. Those compliance certifications are obviously not available if you are running it on-prem. You have to get them yourself. Then data control, customer control, and so all those things are pretty much available across everywhere. And depending on the in case of Azure regions, it's not really there because Microsoft is controlling the data. But in case of your own infrastructure, you have the full control because the data is in your servers, in your hardware. You have to manage things in case of your own infrastructure, but Arc lets you use the software provided by Microsoft. And in case of Azure, everything is managed by them. So I hope this kind of gives you an idea where Arc sits when it comes to capabilities differences. So here are a couple of screenshots where how do you create a data controller? So you create a data controller using Azure portal itself. And like this is a screenshot from Data Studio. I don't have a demo ready, so I've got screenshots for you. So over here, I'm connected to a Azure Arc enabled data controllers. So I've got one EKS cluster here, I've got one GKE cluster, and I've got one on-prem Kubernetes cluster. And on this, I'm running these SQL managed instances. The exact same SQL managed instances are available in my Azure portal as well. So I can see that in the Azure portal and manage them right from here. This is an example of SQL Managed instance in Azure Portal. So I've got SQL Managed instance visible in Azure Portal where I'm able to manage the whole monitoring aspects of it using this. And that brings us to the end of the session.